A ticket to a sporting event is not a license to verbally abuse players or umpires. In recent news, Ketel Marte was brought to tears after being harassed by a fan about his deceased mother. Just awful. Earlier this season, a Guardians fan was heckling Jarren Duran about his suicide attempt in 2022. Seriously. I mean, what is happening in society where people think they can just say whatever they want without consequence? But before you start blaming Twitter and social media, let me stop you, because this sort of thing has been going on a long time. Fans 100 years ago may have dressed much nicer, but the behavior didn't always match the attire. For one fan in New York on May 15th of 1912, that line in the sand, that code of personal conduct, didn't seem to exist. It led to an angry Ty Cobb hopping the wall into the stands to mete out some Old West level of justice. It led to a suspension for Cobb by American League President Ban Johnson. Cobb's teammates were incensed, and they refused to play if Cobb's suspension stood, leading a frantic Huie Jennings to recruit players off the streets of Philly for the day's game against Connie Mack and the Athletics. It's a story that the talented Paul Jackson wrote about on Substack in Project 318. Paul has been on here before talking about the brawl in Atlanta, and he joins me today to share his incredible research. Paul, welcome back, my friend. Last time we talked, you were working on a book focused on 1970s baseball stories. Can you give me an update on how that's going?
I can. Thanks for having me back, Gordon. The book is in the 26th mile, which is a great place to be in the marathon, but it also is a really slog. So I'm on my last chapter. I've saved the best for last. I'm writing up the legendary playoff series in 1973 when Pete Rose gets into a fight with the Mets shortstop Bud Harrelson. And this sets off a war between Rose and the city of New York and Mets fans, and then becomes kind of something that follows him for years to come. So it's one of my favorite stories from the decade. So I'll be digging into that over the rest of this summer, and then I'll have that thing all packaged up and ready to ship off.
Fantastic. I'm definitely looking forward to that. I'm a big reader, and so I'm anxious to see what comes out of that. So you wrote a 4-part series on your Substack, which I will provide a link to down below, about this game that we're going to talk about today, that consisted of replacement players for the Detroit Tigers. Now, this game was in 1912. There's a lot of meat here, but let's see if we can kind of summarize the events that led up to this game. Most people have heard the story about Ty Cobb assaulting a handicapped fan, and the specifics of it may be more interesting and complicated than one might think. Can you tell us a little bit about the precursor to the infamous game?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's May 15th, 1912. Cobb is at the peak of his powers. He's coming off back-to-back MVP years for Detroit. He hit .419 in 1911, and when you include his walks, he was on base 46% of the time, which he's breaking the game of baseball, right? At this point in his career. So he's a huge star. He's probably, I would say, the biggest star in baseball at this particular moment. The Tigers are not an awesome team. They're in the hunt, but they're not a front runner. They're at Hilltop Park in New York, facing the Highlanders, who had become the Yankees, who are not anything to write home about. And during the game, there is a lot of back and forth between Cobb and a group of fans along the third base line. Some of the other players may have been involved as well, but really these guys were planting most of their vitriol onto Cobb, and he was giving it back to one degree or another. But kind of halfway through the game, he is returning from the field, and he kind of goes over to the New York dugout, and he would say later that he was actually looking for their team president because he kind of wanted to report on these fans and get them thrown out of the game, but he couldn't find the team president or any figure in authority. So he walks back to his own dugout, and somebody says something at that moment, and Cobb kind of vaults over the gate, which is right next to the visitors' dugout, and is on this guy in seconds. And it's really interesting to read the sort of contemporary accounts, because on the one hand, they would not say specifically what was exchanged, what words were exchanged between these individuals. They would characterize the words, say unspeakable language, right? This is talk fit for a mining camp, right? All sorts of sort of editorial summations, but few details. But when we're talking about the fight itself, the details flow. So, like Ty Cobb turned this man's face into a, paste of hamburger, and, treating it like a prize fight. And, it went one round and Cobb was the knockout winner, and just so much language. So it's interesting to see what was sort of censored and what was indulged in.
After his ejection, Cobb had to walk all the way across the field to the center field gate. There were no tunnels from the dugout. Here's Cobb in New York City, slowly walking across the field after beating one of New York's own to a pulp. The reaction? He was applauded. Maybe not quite a standing ovation, but clearly those in attendance had heard enough from Mr. Lucker.
So this was where it really starts to get interesting to me, too, because I knew the story at its broadest elements as well, right? And I couldn't understand. I mean, Ty Cobb is a hated figure almost everywhere, right? He's one of the most unlikable men in baseball. And, like Pete Rose in the 1970s, you might love Ty Cobb if he's on your team, but you sure don't love him anywhere else. And here he's attacked this fan. And so what you're seeing reflected in that gesture by the crowd, there's about 3,500 people in the park, which is not a full park. And it was quiet enough that people could hear what was being said between Cobb and the fan, and the one fan in particular, but the group of fans. The fan was a known commodity at Hilltop Park. He had a piercing voice. He was a regular. He would come to many of the games and often would heckle the opposing players. And people heard what he said to Ty Cobb and broadly found it to be wildly beyond the pale, inappropriate things to say to somebody. There were New York businessmen who would give their name and address to the Tigers manager after the game to testify on Cobb's behalf later, if it came to that, about how he had been provoked in the situation. So really the crowd was largely with Cobb because he had been subject to a sort of verbal abusing that New Yorkers in that era objectively found to be beyond the pale, beyond what was acceptable in the kind of ballpark chatter that was a part of the culture of the game.
The fan, Claude Lucker, had an interesting history. Mr. Lucker had been seriously injured a year earlier in a printing press accident in which he lost all of one hand and most of the other. He was well known at Hilltop Park as a serial heckler and was well known to Ty Cobb before the day of reckoning. Cobb said in a statement that the year prior he was being verbally abused by Mr. Lucker and, quote, "I advised him to pass me up. I was only human and trying to earn my living out there, and I could see no justice in his attacking me. His remarks then were insulting, but not obscene." But it seems on this day in 1912, Lucker crossed that invisible line, a line that Cobb could not abide. News of the Lucker-Cobb incident in the New York papers the following day gives us some insight on public opinion. Bear with me a moment because I think this is important. It also highlights the dumbing down of print news today. I had to look up 2 words just while reading this. It's written in part, American League Park, New York, is rapidly earning an odorous reputation. A noisy fan in the left field stands at yesterday's game heaped abuse and vilification on Ty Cobb until the outraged player was provoked into administering a well-deserved beating, the recipient emerging therefrom with a sadly marked physiognomy. Huie Jennings stated after the game that the spectator had applied opprobrious epithets to Cobb. While the player's act cannot be condoned, he is only human. Bystanders declared that Ty gave the fan ample warning of the impending assault, but he refused to give heed. In subsequent retellings, Mr. Lucker claimed that as Cobb rained blows on him, someone shouted to Cobb that he was attacking a man with no hands. Cobb's infamous reply, quote, "I don't care if he has no feet."
I think really the reason why Lucker was unable to defend himself during the attack by Ty Cobb is because he had just been ambushed by, one of the best athletes at the prime of his career, right? I'm not sure the rest of his fingers would have really made much of a difference in that situation. But it'd become an easy kind of tag on the story, right? That Cobb had attacked not just a fan, but a fan who had an apparent disability. Not sure Cobb noticed it until later. But so at that game, for a little recreation, relaxation while he was in town on other business, was Byron Bancroft Johnson, or Ban Johnson, who is the president of the American League. He is the dominant power in Major League Baseball. He established the American League, and notably, he established the American League as a place where people could go for an orderly baseball experience. He wanted clean play and clean players, and was able to kind of pull his own minor league up to the level of a major league, kind of by the force of his will and the ethos that he brought to wanting to have an orderly ballpark. And so he happened to be at this game for fun. He was sitting with a retired umpire up high up in the stands, but high enough that he didn't really hear what was going on down by the dugout. He was not sitting right nearby, where you'd imagine an owner's box or something like that would be. So all he saw was Cobb jump into the stands and just beat the tar out of this guy. He was on hand to see how vicious that looked to the people who were there.
Ben Johnson's ultimate decision came down to the fact that Cobb entered the stands. It's a line that simply can't be crossed. As the Detroit team was on a train headed to Philly, somewhere along the way, Ban Johnson made that decision that Cobb would be suspended indefinitely. The Tigers learned of the suspension upon arriving in Philadelphia for the next series. The players immediately and universally backed their teammate and told manager Huie Jennings they were not going to play as long as Cobb was suspended. Ban Johnson was having none of it. He threatened Tigers owner Frank Navin with a $5,000 fine for every game missed. And this was significant enough of a threat that Navin was afraid it could cost him his franchise.
So it's incredible that the Tigers coalesced around Cobb as quickly as they did, and how quickly the message went from this was a personal thing between Ty Cobb and the fan to this is a moment of injustice that affects all players. So there was some really interesting discussions that must have happened. The players got to Philadelphia, they huddle in their hotel rooms, and they learned that Cobb has been indefinitely suspended. Maybe the Tigers are unhappy because they lost their star. They know that if they're going to make any kind of run, they need Ty Cobb, right? Maybe it's a guy like Jim Delahanty, who is a veteran player, second baseman for the team, who would become a spokesman for the striking players. Maybe he's pushing an agenda behind the scenes and using this to light a match around collective action in baseball. We just really don't know. But the narrative shifts very quickly. Everything in this story happens just so quickly. And, so a few hours after the announcement, the Tigers are telling Johnson that if you don't change your mind on this, we're done as a team. Yeah, we're not going to play. But that would have carried such significant penalties, and those penalties would have all gone to Frank Navin, who is the owner of the team. If the team doesn't play, it's the owner who is charged the sort of it's a listed penalty in the handbook that would have gone straight to the owner and hit his pocketbook, and it potentially would have eventually, if the Tigers aren't the Tigers, what are they, right? Like if nobody is showing up to play for the Tigers, that had happened prior in baseball when teams fell apart, and those franchises would eventually be reassigned elsewhere. So Navin saw a real sort of existential threat. So he tells the manager of the Tigers, Hughie Jennings, that while he supports the players and he knows, there's real feeling and conviction here, that at the end of the day, the Tigers have to have a team on the field for the next day's game, and it becomes Jennings' responsibility to ensure that that happens one way or another.
So Hughie Jennings is tasked to field a team, any team. Frank Navin told his manager he didn't care who it was, whoever he could find. He told Hughie Jennings, I don't care if it costs $10,000, right? We got to field a team. So Hughie Jennings goes out into, I guess, the mean streets of Philadelphia.
So he says that he is going to find a team, and he tells reporters. So that's the first step, is like to tell the players this is going on with or without you, right? Like that's the first challenge. So he tells reporters that he's going to conduct he's searching around the world for a replacement team. And the game is 3 hours away at this point, right? And so the reporters are like, how are you going to search around the world in 3 hours? And then he says something like, well, I'm checking in New Jersey, that's for sure. So there were some kind of grand ambitions here, right, that we all could imagine had to get much more practical very quickly. So he is connected. It might have been Connie Mack who did it, who was the manager of the Philadelphia Athletics and an enormous figure within the game at this time. He connects Huie Jennings to a sports editor and a reporter who is his son at a local newspaper. And the initial idea is to basically procure the St. Joseph's College baseball team. It's a nearby Catholic college. And this team had played against the Tigers bench squad in a minor league or in a spring training exhibition and acquitted themselves pretty well. And I think the idea was very appropriate, which is just let's throw a college team in uniform and we'll get something passable. But for one reason or another, the St. Joseph's College team is not available. Maybe they're out of town. I couldn't quite tell. He also tries to get a group of college players from Penn University, but their manager is a recently retired major leaguer, and he basically forbids his team from participating out of solidarity with the striking Tigers, right? So there goes plan A and plan B, and now time is quickly running out. And so these two journalist figures, they had connected to a guy named Aloysius Travers, or Al Travers, who is the assistant manager for the St. Joseph's College baseball team. He is not a player on that team. His job is how he knows the reporters is he's the one that feeds them stats so that they can report those stats in the paper, right? They had went to Travers as a go-between to get to the college players, but the college players are not available. Travers is a local kid, and they say to him, all right, here's where we're at. We just need anybody at this point. So the neighborhood, who's around. You just got to find us some guys and bring them down to the ballpark. And that's how far the situation had deteriorated. And so Travers says, okay, sure, totally.
The team assembled that day was quite the cast of characters. The lineup construction looked as follows. Leading off and playing second base, Jim McGarr, a 23-year-old machinist in a locomotive factory. Okay, so he's young, probably physically fit. Maybe he could play? Turns out, no. McGarr would wear the golden sombrero before the day was over. 4 Ks, 4 at-bats. At third base, batting second, Billy Maharg, a.k.a. Doddles. 31 years old, a farmhand, auto mechanic, former boxer, and otherwise shady character. Maharg may have had ties to the Jewish mafia. My research intern Charles and I are currently working on the story of Benny Koff, in which Doddles Maharg plays a significant role. Maharg would be replaced after getting drilled in the teeth at the hot corner in the first. His replacement was utility man Bill Irwin, 34 years old, a journeyman minor league player and one-time bullpen catcher for the Phillies. Why he didn't get the start over Doddles? Good question. Irwin would collect 2 of the 4 hits for the Tigers on this day, including a triple. Batting third, the aforementioned pitcher Alan Travers. Travers himself would be pinch hit for late in the game, and more on that later. In the cleanup position, left fielder Dan McGarvey, 24, a chauffeur. The profession doesn't tell us much about his athletic ability, but hey, at least he's young. Batting fifth, playing center field, the youngster Bill Linehausser, 18, an auto machinist and another amateur boxer. In the sixth hole, we have Joe Sugden at first base. Sugden, he was 42 at the time, but he actually played ball. He was a catcher from 1893 to 1905 with the Pittsburgh Pirates, St. Louis Browns, and the infamous 1899 Cleveland Spiders. Oh yeah, you may remember the Spiders from an earlier episode, the worst team in MLB history. Batting seventh at catcher, Deacon McGuire. 48 years old, McGuire had been a major league catcher for 26 seasons between 1883 and 1910. He has a career WAR of 24.9 and a career OPS of 713. The guy could play ball. Not coincidentally, he played alongside Hughie Jennings in Brooklyn in 1899 and 1900, and he was on the Tigers staff in 1912. One might question why the guy with a career 1,781 games hits seventh behind a chauffeur and a pair of amateur boxers. But lineup construction is always a little controversial, isn't it? This photo of Mr. McGuire on Baseball Reference really evokes some Nintendo nostalgia in me. He's totally Wario. Batting eighth at shortstop, 40-year-old Patrick Meany, a longtime minor leaguer and semi-pro player who lived just a few doors down from teammate McGar. Note that the box score doesn't give credit to Meany, but recent research points to him being the shortstop that day. And finally, batting ninth, right fielder Joseph Ward, a.k.a. Hap Ward, 26 years old. He worked as a salesman and was apparently a well-known sandlot player in the New Jersey and Philadelphia area. One final player would make an appearance, John Coffey, an 18-year-old. He would come in to relieve the grizzled veteran catcher McGuire.
John Coffey's name does not appear in the box scores because he was playing under the alias of Jack Smith. He's an 18-year-old guy, and it's just like, why are you making this so hard for us to know, right? But the records show that he might actually have been an escaped felon in March. So just a couple months earlier, a guy with this name and of the right age had been arrested for larceny and receiving stolen goods and had been sentenced to 3 years in a Pennsylvania, essentially a prison. And yet here is this same guy playing for the Detroit Tigers 2 months later. So there's a whole other story in there, right? But we're never going to know the details. But it certainly seems like Jack Smith was escaped felon John Coffey, who happened to have some baseball experience.
John Coffey, Gates Brown to Ron LaFleur. I see a trend for the Tigers. In any event, this was the lineup that Al Travers constructed. It didn't involve any analytics, advanced stats, or seemingly any logic at all. In fact, Travers' decision to insert himself as the day's starting pitcher boiled down to one thing.
Yeah, well, he does give some sense of his strategy overall when he says that, he found out that the pitcher would make more money. And so he decided to insert himself as the pitcher, even though he had never pitched in his life. So there you get a sense of 18-year-old Al Travers' lineup construction.
I asked Paul about the mechanics of how these replacement players made it onto the field. It's known that the real Tigers, including Cobb, showed up that day to play, and they were going to force the hand of the umpire. If the umpire removed Cobb, the Tigers would walk off. Paul explains more.
So they were told to come to the park and sit in the stands. And so after they had kind of checked in, they all went out and they sat in the grandstand. And this led to some very understandable misconceptions, which would pass down through history, right? Because if you're watching this happen, you see these guys climbing out of the stands in their civilian uniforms. It's very easy to think that they were just pulled at random out of the seats, right? Like, I don't blame anybody for perpetuating that story, because that's what it looked like for all appearances. But really, they had been planted there because it wasn't quite clear how it was all going to go down. But when it became time that the Tigers did go through with their strike, the Ty Cobb showed up to play, and he had been ordered, or the umpires had been ordered to tell him he needed to leave once the game was about to start. So he warmed up with the team. The Tigers reported to the park and warmed up as a favor to Hughie Jennings, their manager, who they respected enormously and who had been a pretty solid go-between in a very difficult situation here between them and the upper management. So they go to the park, they work out to buy Jennings some time to find this team. And then Cobb and the others leave the field, and Travers and his gang are beckoned. And so they follow the players right into the clubhouse. And it's just a remarkable moment. And we need to know so much more about it than we do, right? Because the Tigers are striking. And these are the strike breakers. These are scabs, right? And some of them are kids, but not all of them are kids. Mm-hmm. And so, this is how really dangerous, violent interactions occur in labor wars, right? Mm-hmm. And yet the Tigers took off their uniforms and passed them to these guys, and were loaning them their equipment, letting them borrow their gloves, because they didn't have any of that stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And so the Travers was borrowed, I think it was Mullen's glove, and the guy was like, just don't steal anything, okay? Just especially not the glove. But showed incredible kindness, I think. This could have been such an angry moment, and yet these two groups are together in the dugout. And I really think that is all about how much the Tigers respected Huie Jennings, right, and felt bad for the situation that he was in, and also saw that these guys were not real threats to them. They were just a bunch of randos.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And as you wrote, they didn't honestly expect to even really play, right?
Yes, they were told it was a stunt.
Yeah,
they were told you'd show up, go in uniform, and then we'd postpone the game. Yeah, but Connie Mack changed his mind on that, apparently.
Thank goodness.
Thank goodness, yes.
The game began with the visiting Tigers going down in order. Shocker. The bottom of the first started as you might imagine for our young Tiger hurler with a leadoff walk. Showing no mercy, Amos Strunk then bunted for a single, bringing Eddie Collins to the plate with two men on. Collins got smart, and he also bunted. The Collins bunt was fielded by pitcher Travers, who threw to first, but not in time. Collins earned a single. Harl Maggart tore around third and headed home on the play, but the ball was now in the hands of the one man on the infield most able to make a play. He gunned down Maggart at the plate for out number one. Travers then gets home run Baker to ground out, scoring Strunk. 1-0 Athletics. A walk, stolen base, a single, another stolen base, and then Stuffy McGinnis is caught stealing to end the inning. 3-0 Athletics. As the innings progress, the Athletics continue bunting on the Tigers, with third baseman Doddles Maharg now playing a shallow left field after taking a ground ball to his teeth. The replacement Tigers get their first man on base in the top of the third when 9-hole Hap Ward draws a walk. It's a small victory as Ward is gunned down trying to steal second base. In the top of the fourth, Bill Irwin, pinch hitting for Doddles, earns the team's first hit with a triple to right field. But he's ultimately left stranded as new pitcher Carol Brown gets a couple of easy ground balls. In the top of the fifth, the stacked bottom of the Tiger lineup pays dividends. Back-to-back singles by 42-year-old Sugden and 48-year-old McGuire, then a hit by pitch loads the bases for 9-hole Hap Ward. In reading the game log, it appears there's an attempted back pick from the Athletics catcher Jack Lapp, who commits a throwing error, scoring 2 runs. Suddenly, the game is 6-2 in the fifth. Not quite the beatdown the Athletics were envisioning.
But yeah, all of a sudden it doesn't look embarrassing. And I'm sure that the Athletics had been told, if the Tigers are fielding a team, you guys can't walk off, then you're going to take the loss, right? So as soon as Connie Mack knew that the Tigers were, going to have a team in uniform, he started talking to the players about that. And then he also kind of made sure that they understood that this was an official game. So whatever you all are able to accomplish in this game is a part of your official record. And so that got really interesting. So then, yeah, when it started to, maybe they were taking it easy just to kind of see how things were going to play. But when these guys proved to be not entirely hopeless, it seems like there was a moment where the Athletics decided to kind of turn on the jets, so to speak, and not show whatever mercy they might have been showing in those first couple of innings. So the final score was 24-2.
Okay.
And Al Travers pitched the entire game, complete game performance. He recorded a strikeout against one of the pitchers that was used in the game. Connie Mack did rest his pitchers, so 3 different pitchers took a piece of the game. And it is the single worst complete game line in baseball history, as you can imagine. But I just, the whole story is filled with these like moments of quiet dignity because, yeah, it's the single worst complete game line in baseball history, but it's a complete game line in baseball history. Like he had multiple innings where he held the Philadelphia Athletics scoreless. There's, one of the chauffeur threw a guy out who was trying to stretch for a inside the park home run.
I love it.
Like there are these moments that these guys would never forget for the rest of their lives, right? Like clarion moments in their entire existence. And so, yeah, they got horribly mangled, as we would all, rightly expect. But they also had these incredible moments where they accomplished something, right? Something small, except for Billy Maharg, who got hit in the mouth by a ground ball. He was so afraid of playing the infield. He was in left field trying to play third base, and he still managed to get hit in the mouth by a ground ball and maybe lost some teeth. So he had to come out of the game at that point. But almost everybody else got a nice moment somewhere along the way. Huie Jennings was a great player in the 19th century, and he is, I think, in his mid 40s at this point. I'm sure he was still in good shape. A very fun dude. By all my accounts of him. And he decides he wants to take an at-bat. So he comes out of retirement and he takes an at-bat and he strikes out. But what's interesting is who he strikes out against. He strikes out against a rookie pitcher. Maybe he's in his second year, but a rookie player named Herb Pennock, who will one day be in the Hall of Fame in his own right? But by that one at-bat, Herb Pennock finishes his career in 1934, and he's facing, at that point in his career, Tigers like Gehringer and Greenberg and Mickey Cochran, right? And he also faced Hughie Jennings, who started his career in 1891. So that is a 45-year line of baseball that is connected by this one at-bat.
So, Paul, what was Van Johnson's reaction to the game? Was he going to let this go on? Was there going to be a game 2 in Philadelphia with Travers back on the
Travers? Yep, icing up his arm and getting right back out there. So obviously not. This was a farce, and people enjoyed it because it was a farce. But Van Johnson found it appalling. It also constituted kind of a loophole, right? That it had been, the Tigers had figured out we can actually escape some of the consequences here by doing this. And so he immediately told the Tigers that the team was kind of their games were postponed until further notice. The strike needed to be resolved before anything else could happen. So there would be no more games. This presumably spared Frank Navin the penalties, that there was not going to be any forfeits in the meantime because it had been Johnson's action. But the strike kind of ends because Johnson says that, clearly now that the Tigers are not a team, no other teams were joining them in their strike, even though it had seemed for a moment like that might happen. But organizing at this level is really, really hard, as we'll see again and again through history. And so ultimately the rest of the team sat out, but the Tigers were kind of, doing their own thing, and it was nobody's problem. But then Van Johnson says, we are going to reconstitute the Tigers from the other teams. Right. And so all of a sudden it is everybody's problem, because the players don't want that. The other team owners don't want that. So it goes from being kind of sympathy for the Tigers to, we really need to wrap this up now before Johnson starts ripping teams apart to create a new Tigers. And so Frank Navin comes to Philadelphia to meet with his players. Ty Cobb makes a pretty moving speech and urges the players to stand down. He thanks them for all that they've done in support of his cause, but wants them to stand down out of appreciation and respect for Frank Navin, who they all really like. And Navin agrees to pay their fines that they've accrued while on strike. So they come out of it with really no meaningful gains from a labor perspective, but something in terms of being able to kind of restart their careers without, hardly any penalty, having, transgressed in a pretty spectacular way against Ban Johnson's orderly American League. So that in itself constitutes kind of a win.
During Paul's research for this story, he found this photograph of Al Travers. He was featured in the local paper with the caption, "Strike-breaking pitcher."
And I found that photograph, and I was so excited to find the actual photograph that was being discussed in this anecdote, and I put it in the article because it's a really nice picture of him. But yeah, there was I think it was a trolley strike going on in Philadelphia at the time, and so a lot of feelings around kind of striking and organizing and labor, and his parents were evidently pro labor and supporting the strike that was going on in the neighborhood. So mom saw this picture and kind of dragged him out of bed by the hair and said, "Why am I seeing you breaking a strike in the newspaper?" And so she had to be explained what was happening, and Travers said he ended up giving her the $50 that he had made for his work at this game, and that went a long way in their house at the time. So he escaped retribution there.
Excellent. Fantastic story. Really enjoyed it, man. Your writing is top notch. Gosh, if anybody who's watching my channel, you would love Paul's work. You gotta find Substack. Again, I'll provide a link down below. And I'm eagerly anticipating your book. Yeah, it's great, man. You have a gift. So other than the book, what are you working on? What's coming up for you on Substack?
I just finished. I gave a presentation at the Society of Baseball Researchers conference in Dallas, and so that was really cool. Glad to have that one done and under my belt. And this week I'm going to be working on. We just lost Dave Parker right before his induction into the Hall of Fame, and I've been sitting on a really interesting and poignant Dave Parker story from the early 1980s. So I'm really excited to get a chance to talk about him and to tell that story, because I'm always interested in what kind of adversity players are working through to have the success that they do. And Dave Parker certainly had his share. Wasn't a perfect guy by any means, but certainly had his share. So I'm excited to do some writing about him.
Oh man, great timing. Good. Look forward to that. Thanks so much for your time, Paul. It was a treat, as always.
Hey, Gordon. Always a pleasure. Anytime. Love to come on and talk some of these stories with you.
Thanks, man.